My name's John Anderson. I've been writing code for a living for quite a while. To give you an idea what that means, that's Ruby since... I hope that doesn't mean that a wire's come unplugged. Can you hear me? Anything? Is that better? Oh, clearly I need to adjust my microphone here. Sorry, I've got to stop that. Okay, is that better? Yeah. All right. I've been writing Ruby since about 2004 and HTML since 3.2 with Shiny and New, and enough C, C++, and Java to be really, really tired of braces, parentheses, and semicolons, especially the missing ones. I occasionally ride up and down rocky inclines on motorcycles. I was going to call this talk Do-It-Yourself Sport, but we're not at a sport conference, so I changed it to Do-It-Yourself Rube. And coincidentally, I later found out that these things are also called Rube Goldberg machines, which means an unnecessarily complex arrangement which achieves little other than amusement. And I have to say I've seen software that looks like that. Rube can also be a word for a mark, a convictum, a not-so-smart person. Like the time I was sitting in traffic, waiting to turn right, and this dude's gesturing at the front of my car, and I think, well, something's wrong, so I open the window. And he says to me, "This is my dream car. You look like Tom Cruise. Your son looks like Ben 10. And he starts a patter about a birthday and his promotion, or was it the other way around? His birthday and a promotion. Hands me a hat through the window. I put it on my son's head. He says he normally asks for a donation. So I said, okay, fine, here's a few rands. I normally ask for a donation of at minimum 50 rands. So I give him the hat back, and at this point the lights changed, and I drive off. And then I realized that what a rube I'd been, and I was really cross with myself. I wanted to go back and tell him exactly what I thought of him, but I had to get going, so I couldn't. That video was, oh, by the way, I don't have, my sponsor, being me, has to pay school fees, so I don't have swag, but I do, however, have these little endorphin kicks, which are also called chocolates, nice chocolates. And the rules are that the first person who shouts out the name of the movie gets a chocolate, and you can't get two. Right, so that movie, does anybody know what it's called? No one? Okay, it's called Cog. And clearly nobody has seen it before. Cog, yeah. Okay, fine, you get a chocolate. I should go into baseball, geez. So where was I? Let's see, Cog, yeah. I coincidentally found that. It's a Honda advertisement, clearly, and it has real physical parts that is not CGI. There are two small places where there's CGI, where the water's spraying, and one point where the muffler's rolling over. It took 6 months, 606 takes, and by the time they finished, they had two 18-wheeler trucks full of Honda parts. And it is exactly 2 minutes long, and as most of us here know, sometimes it takes a lot of work to make things just work. Okay, so I had, give me 1 second here. I've got to close that down. I have a project that grew up slowly over a period of time, so it wasn't a huge code base. It got to a point where I wanted to gemify one part of it so that I could, naturally enough, use the gem in another project. I had a little bit of configuration in the project, and my problem was that some of the configuration belonged to the application and some belonged to the gem. And I didn't want to end up with two really small configuration files because my configuration consisted of about 8 lines of YAML. So naturally enough, I went looking for a gem that did configuration, which was quite frustrating, at least partly because there are 29 gems to handle configuration. Yes, you heard me right, 29 gems for configuration. You've got to be pulling on my leg. Thank you. You can tell I've got kids and I watch these movies too often. This has happened before. When I was a young man, it was nearly impossible to get started on a Java web project because there were 50 frameworks that had to be evaluated first. 50 frameworks, I tell you. Anyone? Thank you. You guys are good. Just as well I bought lots of chocolate. This is not the only place where this kind of proliferation happens. I mean, JavaScript frameworks, just off the top of my head, or it was the top of my head when I wrote the talk, there's Ember, Backbone, Meteor.js, CanJS, Angular. And they're proliferating as we speak, probably. And the traditional idea behind libraries is they're a good way to get functionality into your application without the associated costs of development, testing, maintenance. And generally, it works pretty well. However, it can get out of hand because you find something cool or funky or new, and you decide you want to get your name up in those shiny GitHub lights. So you really put it in a gem and you release it with too little documentation, and then it languishes on Ruby gems at version 0.1.1 for the next several years. You can cover your eyes now and put your hand up if you've done that before. Does anybody feel a strong need for penance? No? All right, fine. I had a suggestion, but you don't want it, so that's cool. Fortunately for us, the opposite of that applies to web development in Ruby and development in general in .NET. If you're in Ruby, generally, you just pick Rails and get on with it. If you're in .NET, you generally just open the IDE and get on with it. So ironically, if there are more than a few libraries to solve any particular problem, sometimes it takes longer to find the right library than it does just to write your own code. Do it yourself, Rube. It reads the YAML file and puts it into a dot notation in 2 lines. So do you really need a configuration gem for that? Not so much. All right, naturally, or maybe coincidentally, I have a theory. See, that's one of the nice things about these talks at conferences is that I get to bend everybody's ear about my own pet theory. Leaky abstractions. If you know these already, please bear with me. A stream is a good example of a leaky abstraction. And you can see this one at some point leaked a little bit. Of course, I'm talking about I/O streams here. They're pretty easy. You read to them, you write from them, they eventually come to an end. But that is half the story. The other half of the story is that files and network ports and strings can all be treated as streams. However, each one of those has properties which are not accessible through the stream abstraction. For files, you've got metadata, including a file name, user, group, permissions, a modification date, a size. For network ports, you have a different kind of metadata, and whereas files are limited in length, network ports are potentially infinite. Okay, fine. Strings are definitely limited in length, but they're usually an order of magnitude or 2 smaller than files. Okay, so no big deal, some abstractions leak. Well, no. All abstractions necessarily leak, otherwise they wouldn't be abstractions. Because what we do with an abstraction is we look at a bunch of things, and we take out what's common between those things, whatever we want to be in common between those things, in a sense, and we usually give that commonality an existence by naming it. And we do this all the time. It's called thinking. There's a branch of philosophy dedicated to this. I think it's called scatology or eschatology. I can never remember which one's which. And it works pretty well, abstraction that is, thinking sometimes not so much. And it only really gets dangerous when you try and do it in the car, or when you allow yourself to be lulled into a false sense of security because you go in the wrong direction in your slides, because you forget that the concrete thing that you're dealing with through the lens of your abstraction still has an existence in its own right, and other abstractions can equally apply. Just as well we're dealing with the stuff in the abstract, otherwise I'd be handing out nose plugs instead of chocolates. So, for example, you're reading from a stream, you're reading from a file using a stream as the abstraction, and you forget that it's a file, and you slurp the whole thing into memory. You might be lucky, and it's a small file, in which case you've got no problem, or it might be a big file, in which case you're going to run out of memory. Or worse, you try to slurp the entire mythical Twitter fire hose into memory using a network port, in which case you have a big problem. Sometimes you even actually need the leaky bits, the particularities. For example, you're parsing a file using a stream to read it, and you find yourself in a situation where you can't parse it, and you'd really like to throw an exception, including the name of the file. But streams don't have names in the abstraction, so you've got a bit of an issue here. So I don't think it makes much sense to differentiate between leaky abstractions and non-leaky abstractions. They're all just abstractions, and they all leak to a greater or lesser extent, depending on 2 things. Firstly, the generality of the abstraction. The more general the abstraction is, the more it's going to leak. And secondly, the complexity of the concrete thing behind the abstraction. The more complex it is, the more the abstraction is going to leak. And the kind of ironic part here is that if you work with abstractions a lot, you often find yourself writing code to deal with the leaky bits, which amounts to redistributing the concrete items or the particularities at a level where you can access them. Okay, this is a bit of a stretched example, but each stream has an instance of a stream metadata, and you've got a file metadata, a network metadata, and a string metadata. And their only reason is to get back to the fileness or network portness or stringness of the thing underlying the abstraction, which is the abstraction leaking, really. Okay, so back to the 29 gems. All of them, or at least all of the ones I looked at, I got bored pretty quickly. Most of them, they all had a different idea of what should be in a configuration gem. What is this configuration abstraction that we're busy trying to write a gem to deal with? Most of them used YAML. Most of them were hierarchical, so you could have several levels of configuration. Some of them would read from environment variables or the command line. There was one that had pluggable backends, which were YAML, JSON, SQL, NoSQL, ini files, dot notation. I think that covers it. Some of them allowed for encryption. Some of them allowed for encryption only of certain values, like passwords. Okay, so there were lots of ideas of what the best way to do this is. And I had to ask myself, take the one with the pluggable backends, for example. Was the author trying to deal with their own particular problems, or were they trying to solve all the potential problems in the problem domain? And if they were, they're solving all of our problems too, which is really nice and kind of thoughtful. But I have to say, in my experience, most of us don't really know what our own problems are until we're halfway through writing the code to solve them. So I started wondering, how could somebody else know how to solve our problem when they don't know the particularities of our situation? And the only way you could do that is if you covered the entire problem domain. But for a problem that starts out with, I have a little persistent hash, I have a couple of values here, and I need those to be, I need to read them from somewhere. The problem domain turns out to be quite a lot bigger than you initially think, and I think that's one of the reasons that we end up with so many configuration gems, because it's a bigger problem than you think it is. And, okay, so I think that this also goes to attention at the heart of software development, which is that if you have a problem, do you try and solve the most general version of that problem, or do you try and deal with your part of the problem, the part of it which is specific to you? It's kind of like the Windows registry being the general version versus the Unix /etc directory. And for me, I prefer the /etc directory because, in my opinion, the real world is messy and it changes continually, and the more we try and pin it down, the more it escapes. On the other hand, if you don't abstract at all, you end up with spaghetti. Coincidentally, I saw this slide, and seeing as somebody else said it, it must be true, right? It's kind of like when you see something on Twitter, it's kind of like seeing it on TV, only more proofier. I was at a code retreat in May, and the phrase dimensions of mutability came out of my mouth. Well, I was surprised. It's kind of, dimensions of mutability. Well, I think you could also call this the orthogonal feature set of, well, in this case, the configuration gems. I quickly put this together. And you'll notice that a combined file for application plus gem is not on here. So is the problem domain not adequately covered by these 29 gems? Have I found some kind of a leak in the abstraction? Or am I just expecting too much? Well, when I was evaluating the gems, when I was looking at them, I felt a little bit uncomfortable because everything seemed to be happening somewhere else. Everything felt a bit kind of Goldbergish. And I don't know if it was Rube or Adele at work here. And I think part of the reason for that is that most of them seem to involve some level of DSL aiming at syntactic sweetness. And I started wondering to myself, that is basically just resulting in the implementation of language features at a different level, which is that redistribution of particularity as I was talking about with the metadata. Because you can do that with that. So why do we do that? And in terms of syntactic sweetness, I have to also say that to me, I find it kind of surprising that that is regarded as too verbose, because I remember that. And I'm glad I don't do that very much anymore. And this kind of leads on to something else that I was thinking about, which was, in a compiled language, you have a strict separation between code and data. Data can only become code when you compile it. And perhaps that is part of the reason why we normally regard configuration files as something that happened in text files, because that's how it was done, and it was the only way to do it in a compiled language. And there is, of course, another good reason, and it's related to these. And I don't know about you guys, but I've spent a lot of time patching Rails lately, and it's all YAML's fault. No, it's JSON's fault. No, it's eval's fault. No, it's actually a consequence of the fact that we're working in an interpreted language, and code is data. So data can become code, especially, and if you're not careful, somebody else's data can become code that executes somewhere that you don't want it to. And it's also a result of something else that often happens with abstractions, which is this. The misconception is YAML is hashes. And most of the time, YAML is hashes. But actually, serialization formats, of which YAML is one, instantiate objects. So under the right conditions, in this case, string substitution, you can end up with somebody else's data becoming your code. And that's great in most cases because you serialize an object to YAML, and then you just deserialize it, and hey presto, there's your object back. But it's a problem because that can go wrong pretty easily. So it's kind of ironic that compiled languages sort of have security by default because data can't become code, but when you're in an interpreted language, you have to work a bit harder to ensure that your data does not become code. So it's quite nice to see that this popped up really quickly, which is safe YAML, and it refuses to deserialize anything that is not a basic object. And my thought there was, well, so much for everything is an object, because that doesn't always apply. Anyway, here we are again. I should have called this talk Alibaba and the 29 Gems. In my opinion, these are some reasons which are driving the proliferation of the 29 configuration gems, and I think this may apply to other situations as well. And you guys can all read, so read away, and I'm going to have a sip of water because my mouth is getting dry. So ironically, or perhaps coincidentally or naturally, this situation pushed me to... Say what? Yeah, you're right. This is what some people are paying attention. That's the nice thing. I know, not everybody's going to sleep in my talk. This pushed me to... That was probably not a good idea. This pushed me to solve the problem I had, which was how do I get the configuration for one application and one gem into one file? It pushed me to solve my own particular needs. And in doing so, I ironically got rid of all those dimensions of mutability, which were not relevant to my problem. So I ended up with something like that. This particular one, it does not need encryption, but it does need one or two other things, including reloading the configuration file when the configuration file changes. Then I have another little app which doesn't need anything except encryption. In this case, if the app tried to reload the encryption, at least the configuration, halfway through its run, it would break. So neither of these two apps, in my case, requires that I mistrust the configuration file. And partly driven by this, how do I solve this one configuration file for an app plus a gem, I started wondering to myself, why am I putting what boils down to a nested hash or a nested set of value objects, which are kind of interchangeable in some ways, why am I putting that into a text file, and then I have to deal with parsing and parsing errors and type conversion and overriding and defaulting and convention over configuration. I have to do all of that. Whereas Ruby already has a parser, which throws errors if you get it wrong. It has a concise syntax, and it has a bunch of really nice abstraction mechanisms. So I can put values in modules, classes, in instances, singletons, hashes. I could use inheritance for defaulting different levels of hierarchical values. I can have a situation where, I don't know if you guys have run into this, but I have a UAT server, a staging server, and a production server, all three of which run under the Rails production environment, and all three of which need different email addresses for the reply address to outgoing emails. And that kind of doesn't fit in some ways. And if I was using Ruby to do this, I could just use, say, for example, a case when, to deal with it. So I have other mechanisms that I can use to deal with situations where the straight hierarchical situation is insufficient. I could also use the or equals operator for defaulting. I could use assertions if I wanted to check validation, or I suppose I could theoretically pull in the whole of RSpec to, at runtime, check my configuration, but that seems a bit heavyweight. And I'm not limited to simple values. I can put regular expressions or dates into my configuration files, or anything for that matter. Okay, you can get dates with YAML, but not with JSON. I think the point is still there, which is I could use whatever objects I want. You'll find some configuration files allow for something like ERB-enabled YAML. But ERB-enabled Ruby is an oxymoron. It just becomes irrelevant, which is kind of that getting rid of dimensions of mutability thing. I've got a much simpler situation because I've gotten rid of all of that stuff that I might or might not have to deal with. Okay, so the best thing for all of this for me was that the configuration is all happening right here. It's not happening somewhere else. It's there, where I can see it. And it's quite amazing what happens when you just leave out those dimensions of mutability. I mean, that is barely enough to put in a gist, let alone make into an entire gem. And ironically, I got here because I made assumptions. I said, okay, I don't need any of that stuff. This is what I need. That's sufficient. Of course, it's easy to make the wrong assumptions, so I'm not trying to throw out decades of computer science research here. That would be silly. But it does look like I found a solution to my app plus gem problem. And I have this nagging feeling that somewhere a Lisp machine is laughing at me. And as I said, I got here, ironically, by deliberately not being as general as possible. So it's kind of strange to think this way because as programmers, we write code. That's what we do. And it's kind of weird to look at it and go, well, maybe the answer is not to write more code. And although that can be useful because it can show you what not to do. So I think this is maybe the main point, what I'm about to say now. And if there's only one thing you take away from this, apart from possibly a chocolate, I'd really like it to be this, that there are a whole bunch of really powerful tools in Ruby, which are quite often obscured by syntactic sugar. The standard libraries and def, module, and class are your friend. They really let you do some very powerful stuff. So in spite of the common wisdom, which is use a gem first, that works a lot of the time, you might surprise yourself and save a bit of time by just doing it yourself, Rube. So I guess that's the end of the abstract part of my talk, and I think it looks like I'm pretty much up to time anyway. So I can do two things now. I've got a little bit of code that reads configuration in various different ways. And I'm going to make, it doesn't use any configuration gems, and I would make no attempt whatsoever to pull this into an all-encompassing configuration framework. So I could look at that. But before I do that, just to shake things up. Who was that? I'd like to take some questions now, and then if there's still a bit of time after that, I'd like to look at the code and go through that, and hopefully that would be pretty interactive. So, questions? So that either means oh, okay, great. I think what I ended up doing there was, that was unpleasant because somebody else had put in one of the configuration gems, and I'm not going to name any names here, but that didn't really work. So what I ended up doing was I had a different configuration file for every server because it was the only way I didn't want to hack on the code too much. I was coming into the project later on. Somebody already put something in place, and I didn't want to redo the whole thing. Yeah, it became quite unpleasant because I had a different version of the configuration file for all three servers, and I was quite uncomfortable with that. So I ended up writing a little spec that I could run on each of the three servers just to check that the values would actually make sense. But other than that, I'm kind of a little bit limited on time in that project, so I didn't really have a chance to do it properly. I think I would probably have another level underneath the production, like there would be something like email from production UAT or something like that. Or possibly even just up to production and then allow those to vary differently on the, I would have production.uat and production.staging or pull a host name in somehow. I think that's how I would do it. To keep the configuration in one place where it's easier to see what's going on, because the way it is now, with what I described, it's hard to see that. Anyone else? That's a good point. No. I think that's one of the definitions of a configuration file, actually, is something that doesn't live in the source control. I don't know. I guess I guess it could. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess you could run into that. But on the other hand, if you change something in your configuration, I mean, there's two ways to look at that, I guess. The one is that if you change something in your configuration, it's a YAML file, you'd have to make sure that it works anyway. So presumably you'd have some specs or something like that to test it. And the other way to look at it was I was thinking it might even be worthwhile to have some kind of validation around let me just check that my configuration file firstly still works, and whether that executes in Ruby or whether that parses correctly and gives me sensible values. I don't think there's too much of a distinction there. And secondly, whether the values make sense. Does that answer your question? Anyone else? If you have a question and it feels stupid, there are probably 10 other people who are feeling the same way. All right. How much time do I have? It's 10 past. Does anybody want to look at some code? Okay, there was that one. The interesting part of this one, I think, is that you could potentially put, this is kind of almost accidental, because I was thinking to myself, I have a password that I need to put into a website, and I got tired of typing it over and over. And you could use this, well, I mean, in that case, I didn't want somebody to steal my laptop and get my password, because it was a kind of sensitive password. So I ended up doing this, and kind of accidentally as a result of this, it would allow you to put quite a lot of trust in your configuration files, even if they were executable Ruby, because that would fail to decrypt. If you signed them, they would fail that decryption, or if you just signed them and they were plain text, they would fail the verification. I actually checked that out, and it does work quite nicely. Of course, then you have a whole key management issue, which is another story, but it's potentially one way that you could trust your configuration files. Any questions about that? You could, yeah. You could. I would kind of want to keep it in a slightly separate place, though, because it changes differently. I mean, the source code changes because that's the functionality changing, but I suppose you could, yeah. Anyone else? Other questions about this one? All right. And this one is for the sugar addict in all of us. I don't particularly like nested hashes, accessing nested hashes with the square bracket notation. So this is interesting because I saw it post an article a little while ago about the difference between class object let me try that again. Object-oriented languages and class-oriented languages. And typically, when we say object-oriented language, we actually mean class-oriented language, because every instance of a class is exactly the same. But in Ruby, because of the dynamic nature of it, it's actually an object-oriented language, because any object can be slightly different to any other objects which ostensibly share the same class. Does that make sense? Okay. So, and you can kind of, this is also kind of a good example of the class abstraction leaking, because you have a hash, and this thing is an extension of a hash, and it's pretty simple, actually. It lets you do that. There's the hash, there are the values, and you can do that. There's worker over there, and there's max memory over there, and there's a little bit more sugar from there, and you can go sumhash.worker.maxmemory, but some hash, if you say sumhash.class.name, you'll get back hash. And that's what does it. And it was the shortest way I found of doing that. Does anybody want a brief explanation of that? Is it clear to everyone? The only thing is, the only interesting part is that, which gets called from there, and it basically just makes sure that every key is a hash, every key is a symbol, because that code depends on the keys being a symbol. I need one of those little red things. My arm isn't long enough. All right, questions about this? I just wanted to find the quickest, shortest way of doing it, really. And I didn't want to create more objects. Fair enough, yeah, okay. I've got a couple of things now. I can look at $safe, which is a little bit obscure because neither JRuby nor Rubinia support it. But it does have some interesting stuff in there, but I should probably skip that because I'm out of time. So if you want to see more about $safe or you want an explanation of some of that, I guess talk to me later. That one is, okay, that's also part of $safe. And this one was another one. Some of the gems, some of the configuration gems would read from the environment, and this is it's a similar kind of approach to the previous one, where I've got a module and I'm extending. This is intended to extend a hash, and this will merge whatever values have the same keys as in the environment. It's also a really quick, easy way of doing that. So you don't need to put that in a gem, I don't think. This is kind of one of the places where I'd feel fairly comfortable cutting and pasting, because it's so small. You just use it in different projects. And it would be slightly different every time. Like you might want to have your environment variables prefixed with an application name or something like that, and then you're adding one of those dimensions of mutability, and sometimes I think, what's the point there? Especially if the code is that simple. There's then the next example I've got is uses iNotify. Anyone interested in that? That looks like a solid no. Moving right along. One of the things I like about these talks is I always learn something, and this is what I learned in this case. That is called a global function, and pathname does this. I like pathname a lot, the pathname class. And it's quite interesting because all it really does is you define nested open struct in kernel, and you call new nested open struct. And then you can do that, which I think string and float and integer and array all have one of those. And pathname creates one as well. Can anybody tell me why there's a private there? Yeah, exactly. So you can't say, my string, or I don't know, value equals, and then give it a string, and then say value dot nested open struct. That would make no sense. And that's what I have for you. That was close.